Professor Chaim Harvey Hames. And what he alluded to about the fact that the center was set up exactly a year ago in May 2013 is the fact that you were told on April 30th it begins on May 1st. You were told on May 5th it begins on May 1st, right? And in this year, we have all seen the results of this great efforts. So I'd like to congratulate him, and it looks like a wonderful program. The first section is on Inquisition. What we'll be having is first the lectures and the respondent, and then we'll open it up for discussion. The first speaker is Dr. Paola Tartakoff, who's Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. She received her doctorate at Columbia University as a recipient of fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and the Fulbright and Mellon Foundations. She is also a recipient of 2013 Presidential Fellowship for Teaching Excellence. I'm not sure which president that is, but she received it. Her first book, which was her doctorate, it's called Between Christian and Jew, Conversion and Inquisition, The Crown of Aragon, 1250-1391, which was published by Penn Press. This was her doctorate. I heard her a number of years ago talk about the subject. We were just discussing now about her subject, Peter Eliezer Elazar, that was never quite sure whether or not he was Christian or Jewish, which reminds me of a story which allows me to be the first one to tell a conversion joke at this conference. I hope I'm not the last. About the Jew who was appointed by a king, wanted to be appointed a king to be a minister, and he said you can become a minister only if you convert to Christianity, and he thinks about it, he finally decides, okay, it's worth it. He's working for a number of years as the minister, and the king says, you know what, I know you're honest, I know that you're reliable, you really don't have to be Christian anymore, you can return to being Jewish. He runs home, he's so happy, Chaya, Chaya, we can become Jews again. And she says, idiot, you couldn't wait until after Pesach? The subject of the lecture today will be fear of conversion to Judaism in 13th century Christian segregatory legislation.
Thank you, Professor Lasker. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here this morning. In the section on Jews and his Manual for Inquisitors, the early 14th century papal inquisitor Bernard Guy opened with the following proclamation: perfidious Jews attempt, whenever and wherever they can, to pervert Christians secretly and draw them to the Jewish perfidy, especially those Christians who had formerly been Jews but who converted and received baptism and the faith of Christ. In the process of writing my first book on Jewish conversion to Christianity and the inquisitorial prosecution of Jews and converts in the Crown of Aragon prior to 1391, I read this passage many times. My book was concerned with the re-Judaization of Jewish converts to Christianity, however, and so I focused always on the last part of Guy's pronouncement. That is, that Jews tried especially to bring over, or rather back to Judaism, Jewish converts. The implication that Jews allegedly tried also, if much less frequently, to bring over to Judaism cradle Christians barely registered. It was through the same lens, that is, with a focus on the reversion to Judaism of Jewish converts, that I read the well-known earlier papal bull, Turbato Corde, even though in its first issuing by Clement IV to inquisitors in 1267, this bull did not mention converts at all, but instead noted simply that a number of bad Christians had abandoned the true Christian faith and wickedly transferred themselves to the right of the Jews. Likewise, when I read the bull Contra Christianos, first issued by Boniface VIII, also as an instruction to inquisitors, which distinguished between individuals who returned to the Jewish faith on the one hand, and Christians who converted to the Jewish faith on the other, I again missed the cradle Christians. And when I read Pope Nicholas IV's 1290 bull, Attendite Fratres, which commanded prelates to assist inquisitors on the grounds that, quote, Jews daily fomented apostasy, doing so not only among those of their own who had been baptized in the Christian faith, but infecting born Christians too, I again focused only on the returning converts. When I revisited these texts more recently, however, the references to cradle Christian converts to Judaism called out to me. What are we to make of these? Were cradle Christians actually converting to Judaism in the High and Late Middle Ages? If so, who were these individuals, and what motivated them to risk their lives in these ways? After all, conversion to Judaism was punishable by death. And if Christians were not converting to Judaism, or if only exceedingly rarely, then what can we learn from expressions of concern about the conversion of cradle Christians to Judaism? I am not the first to ask these questions. Yet, with the exception of a controversial monograph from 1966 that greatly overstated the extent of medieval Jewish influence on Christians, these questions have not yet been the subject of systematic scholarly inquiry. In fact, a number of scholars have argued that expressions of concern on the part of high and late medieval Christian authorities about conversion to Judaism reflected nothing more than the force of tradition. That is, they bore no relation whatsoever to the realities of contemporary life. It is true that such statements had a long history. Since late antiquity, popes and church councils forbade an array of Jewish-Christian interactions in the name of preventing Jewish religious influence on Christians. During the first centuries of the Common Era, when Judaism and Christianity were both minority faiths in the Roman Empire that had not yet fully parted ways, and when both faiths attracted converts, the realities of and the potential for Jewish religious influence on Christians were extensive. Jews were formidable rivals by any measure in the eyes of the early church, and segregatory efforts that were intended to degrade Jews and protect Christians from spiritual corruption by Jews formed part of an effort to ensure the church's very survival. By the High Middle Ages, however, the power dynamics between Christians and Jews had evolved dramatically. A vulnerable Jewish minority now lived at the mercy of a mighty Christian majority that cast Jews as the arch-villains in its sacred history, no less. From this perspective, it seems absurd to suggest that Jews were still in a position to influence Christians religiously, let alone bring cradle Christians to Judaism. Indeed, medieval Christians and Jews widely recognized, as do modern scholars, that the dominant culture was far more likely to shape the subordinate culture than vice versa. And of course, there is no question that Christian culture did profoundly shape medieval Jewish life. In light of these observations, it would seem that medieval Christianity actually had every reason to think, or rather that medieval Christians had every reason to think, that Jewish-Christian intermingling would, if anything, draw Jews into the Christian flock, and not the other way around. I shall propose this morning, however, that persistent and, in fact, increasingly frequent references on the part of 13th century Christian authorities to the risk of Jewish religious influence on Christians, and in particular to Christian conversion to Judaism, were far more than rhetorical vestiges of a bygone age. Although these statements, which often appear in documents that decry Jewish-Christian intermingling, exaggerated and distorted certain realities, and even engaged in outright fantasy, when we read them against a variety of other sources, including Jewish texts and Christian archival records, they in fact teach us both about the hopes and fears of their authors, and also about everyday Jewish-Christian interactions. Moreover, in the process, they invite us to think in new ways about majority-minority power dynamics in medieval Christendom. In my paper today, I will first present a brief analysis of the ways in which 13th century Christian authorities portrayed Jewish religious influence on Christians. I shall next present a selection of evidence that illustrates the astonishing degree to which this portrayal was grounded in daily realities, yet also refines our understanding of vital differences between representations and reality. And in conclusion, I shall reflect more broadly on the implications of these observations for reassessing medieval Jewish Christian power dynamics and the role of conversion therein. During the 13th century, broadly defined, popes, kings, bishops, and church councils in regions as far-flung as Italy, England, Hungary, Poland, Spain, Germany, and France decried the fact that Christians and Jews ate and socialized together, that Christian servants lived in Jewish homes, and that Christians and Jews informally debated matters of faith and buried their dead and worshipped in close proximity to one another. These leaders and these governing bodies called for the punishment of Jewish-Christian intermingling and for the segregation of Christians and Jews. In some places, they required Jews to wear distinctive garb, or a distinguishing badge in the name of preventing, or making it impossible to claim, accidental mixing. As the archbishops of Tarragona and Saragossa put it in a letter to the King of Aragon requesting legislation to stop Christians from mixing with Jews, that segregation was essential to preventing many indecent, nefarious, and horrible things. Prime among these abominations was the spiritual corruption of Christians by Jews. In any given instance, documents that advocated segregating Christians and Jews, or punishing Christians and Jews for excessive contact, responded to an array of local realities and served multiple functions. My first aim this morning, however, is to consider this loosely defined body of sources as a whole, and show that doing so offers some new ways of conceptualizing how Christian authorities conceived of the nature and mechanics of Jewish religious influence. I shall argue further that these insights, in turn, actually help us understand how Jewish religious influence could have been possible in 13th century Christendom. Papal, royal, and conciliar sources suggest that Jews could negatively influence Christians religiously in two general ways. First, they could sow doubts in Christians' hearts about Christianity. Our sources describe in detail how Jews allegedly mocked and insulted Christian beliefs and practices in ways that could easily, quote, infect the Lord's sheep. In 1205, for example, in the bull Et si non displiceat, in the context of listing scandalous Jewish behaviors in France, Pope Innocent III described Jews running around the town on Good Friday, laughing at Christians because they adored the crucified one. Innocent also lamented that Jews ridiculed Christians for believing in a peasant who was hung by the Jewish people. Informal Jewish-Christian religious debates, in the course of which Jews inevitably attacked Christian beliefs, for example, about Jesus and Mary, were also liable, in the words of Pope Gregory IX, in his 1233 bull Et si Judaeorum, to cause, quote, simple-minded Christians to slide into the snare of error. The second way that Jews could negatively influence Christians religiously, according to Christian authorities, was by attracting Christians to Judaism. Of course, these two ways of spiritually corrupting Christians were not mutually exclusive. Sowing doubt about Christianity could conceivably lead to attraction to Judaism. In his law code, the Siete Partidas, compiled around 1265, for instance, King Alfonso X of Castile mentioned both in one breath. He specified that, quote, Jews should be very careful to avoid converting any Christian by disparaging Christianity. Christian leaders frequently decried Judaizing among Jews' Christian servants, especially those who lived in Jewish homes. To cite but one example of this, in 1205, in a letter to a priest in the Archdiocese of Sens, in which he directed him to compel Jews' Christian servants to leave their jobs, Pope Innocent III decried how by living together, quote, with those whose stone-heartedness has blinded them to the recognition of the true light, that is, by living together with Jews, Christian servants were introduced into the darkness of error. Christian authorities also alleged, however, that Jews recruited converts outside their homes, thereby attracting a broader swath of Christian society to Judaism. In 1267, in the bull Damnabili Perfidia Judaeorum, addressed to the archbishops and bishops in the counties of Poitiers, Toulouse, and Provence, Pope Clement IV lamented that Jews were, quote, flouting canonical regulations concerning clothing and mingling with Christians, and therefore acting with greater assurance and more boldly attracting Christians of both sexes to their damnable right. In the same year, the Council of Vienne decreed that Jews were not to, quote, lure Christians into Judaism or rashly circumcise them. In 1276, the Council of Béziers accused Jews of fraudulently deceiving many simple Christians and maliciously drawing them into their error. In 1286, in the bull Venerabilis Fratri, Honorius IV instructed the Archbishop of Canterbury and his suffragans to use spiritual and temporal penalties to put an end to Jewish excesses, including, quote, Jews trying to attract to their sect faithful Christians by means of inducements, and criminally inviting them to worship with them on Sabbaths and holidays in their synagogues, where these Christians showed reverence to the parchment scrolls of the Jews and thus Judaized no less than the Jews themselves. In conformity with the Christian anti-Jewish rhetoric and stereotypes of their day, these sources cast Jews as evil predators who lured, ensnared, seduced, infected, and corrupted Christians. In some cases, these same documents accused Jewish doctors of poisoning Christian patients, and Jews in general of being ever at the ready to murder Christians, crucify Christian children, and sell Christian children into slavery. This vituperative anti-Judaism requires that we treat these sources with extreme care. And I'll return in a moment to discuss some of the functions that this antagonistic perspective might have played specifically in the context of concerns about Jewish religious influence. First, however, I would like to suggest that in spite of their deeply problematic nature, royal, papal, and conciliar pronouncements regarding Jewish religious influence on Christians provide intriguing clues about the conditions under which 13th century Jews actually could have religiously influenced Christians. According to these documents, there were, again, two sets of circumstances under which all bets were off when it came to the direction of religious influence. The first involved encounters between Christians and Jews in which the dominant and ecclesiastically sanctioned Jewish-Christian power dynamics, according to which Jews were subordinate to Christians as a punishment for rejecting and killing Christ, were in one way or another subverted. When a Christian lived as a servant in a Jewish home, for example, or Christians attended a Jewish wedding, the Council of Breslau even described Christians dancing at a Jewish wedding, or a group of Christians and Jews informally debated matters of faith, Jews were, respectively, the employer, the social majority, and Christians' peers. In such situations, power dynamics were such that at least in the moment, Jews actually stood a chance of influencing Christians. These sources also indicate that Jews might have been able to religiously influence Christians under a second set of circumstances that depended not on environmental structures, but on individual agency. 13th century documents advocating the segregation of Christians and Jews frequently cite a desire to prevent the danger of romantic entanglements between Christians and Jews. Some of these records refer to Jewish men sleeping with Christian wet nurses who lived in their homes, in which case the power dynamics favored Jewish influence. But others refer to fornication and adultery between Christians and Jews more generally. Although these sources do not directly link sex and conversion, they usually simply condemn interfaith sex as a grave sin in its own right, it is not difficult to imagine how some relationships of this nature could have served as a gateway to Judaizing. Possibly in reference to such ramifications, in 1244 in the bull Impia Judeorum, Innocent IV told the King of France that Jewish-Christian intimacy, quote, brought confusion upon the Christian faith. This raises the possibility that unique personal experiences involving affective bonds could lead individual Christians to contravene widespread societal pressures by converting to Judaism. Similarly, our sources intimate that individuals' intellectual inclinations could also take precedence in certain cases over power dynamics, suggesting, meaning majority-minority power dynamics, suggesting that Jewish texts and Jewish teachers were particularly dangerous. Papal bulls decried not only the Talmud's blasphemous and detestable contents, but in 1213 the Council of Paris denounced the alleged Jewish practice of Jews, quote, wickedly pretending to explain the superficial plausibility of their law to Christians. Affairs of the heart and mind, it seems, could have had the potential to buck broader trends. The vignettes of everyday Jewish-Christian interactions that lie tucked between calls for the harsh restrictions on Jews in 13th century papal, royal, and conciliar sources can make their readers feel like Alice in Wonderland. Everything seems inverted as we encounter outspoken Jews trumpeting their unflattering views of Christianity, and Christians working for, socializing, and even falling into bed with and going over to the religion of the Jews whom these same sources cast as repulsive and whom we tend to think of as social outcasts. When we read these sources against Jewish texts and Christian archival records, however, we find ourselves invited to reassess the nature of typical medieval Jewish-Christian power dynamics, as well as more keenly appreciating ecclesiastical anxieties about Jewish influence and thinking in new ways about why Christian authorities cast Jews as predators, in particular in the context of expressing fears about Jewish influence. To begin, the source's portrayal of the existence of a robust Jewish-Christian rivalry in the 13th century, religious rivalry, was no mere figment of Christian authorities' imagination, and nor was their portrayal of instances of Christian attraction to Judaism. Moreover, the circumstances under which Christian authorities suggested that Jews could influence Christians religiously corresponded to some daily realities as well. It is well known, for instance, that into the late Middle Ages and beyond, Jews employed Christian servants in their homes. And it is well known also that in the privacy of their homes, Jews verbally disparaged Christianity, for instance, recounting the Toldot Yeshu. It seems entirely possible, therefore, although we cannot know what actually transpired in the hearts and minds of Jews' Christian employees, that in some cases the experience of living as servants in Jewish homes did instill in some Christians doubts about Christianity, and it might even have led to varying degrees of Judaizing. As we have noted, in the context of the Jewish home, Jews were in the majority, and social pressure could actually favor becoming Jewish. And there were practical benefits to converting to Judaism in the context of a Jewish home, although there were also drawbacks and disadvantages. We know also that as David Berger noted well over a decade ago, that the assertiveness and self-confidence of Ashkenazic, and I would add Sephardic Jews, were remarkable, and that both groups surprisingly often aired their religious views in public. One context in which they did so was in informal religious debates with Christians. And we have many references to such informal debates. For example, in the early 13th century, Peter of Blois lamented that Jews were more familiar with the Bible than Christian clergy, and usually won arguments. King Louis IX of France famously remarked that when a Jew initiated a debate with a Christian layman, the Christian would do best hastily to pierce the Jew's midriff, so far as his sword would enter. Thomas Aquinas advised against disputations with Jews unless publicly organized and managed by the church. Jews made their religious views known also when, for instance, as happened in a small town in Catalonia in the 1380s, they not quite quietly enough derided Christian beliefs, for example, in the virginity of Mary while strolling by a statue of the Virgin in the town square. Moreover, there are indications that Jewish outspokenness actually did instill doubts in Christians. According to the late 13th century Crusade chronicle of Jean de Joinville, King Louis IX lamented that Christian onlookers at Jewish-Christian disputations, quote, went away misbelievers through not fully understanding the Jews. And an early 14th century inquisitorial transcript quotes the Christian residents of a town in Aragon affirming that blasphemous Jewish outbursts to the effect that Christ was not divine were, quote, strengthening the Jewish sect and sowing doubts in Christians. If in the Jewish home, the dominant balance of power between Christians and Jews was inverted, in these public encounters, it shifted again. Jews were not usually the majority on the street, nor did they possess the ability to impose their will on the Christians whom they casually encountered. Yet they did not live in cowed submission. On the contrary, medieval Jews often had a voice, they were heard, and by all accounts, they possessed an uncanny power of persuasion. An array of sources not only enable us to affirm that it is plausible that Jewish ridicule and refutations of Christianity instilled doubts in some Christians about the Christian faith, and perhaps led some Christian servants in Jewish homes to Judaize, but they also confirm that a small number of middle and upper class Christians officially went over to Judaism during the Middle Ages. There are over 60 documented cases between the 9th and the 14th centuries of relatively wealthy, educated Christians formally converting to Judaism following a period of religious instruction, circumcision in the cases of men, and ritual immersion. And I look forward to learning about even more cases during the next few days because I know that many scholars here are working, for example, on Geniza materials that have to do with more cases of conversion to Judaism. So we learn about this from records from the Cairo Geniza, documents from archives in Catalonia and England, tombstones from Germany, the writings of rabbinic authorities, proceedings of the medieval Inquisition, and a few accounts by individual converts. Moreover, As conversion to Judaism was of necessity clandestine, and as few records of such conversions were produced and even fewer have survived, it is likely that there were more cases than we shall ever know. It is particularly intriguing that during the 13th century, when references to conversion to Judaism peaked in papal, royal, and conciliar sources, they peaked also in the writings of Northern European rabbis, as well as in archival records. Moreover, in consonance with the hints that we noted in papal, royal, and conciliar documents, these Jewish texts and archival records indicate that romantic liaisons and the experience of studying Hebrew and Jewish sources with rabbis often played a role in these conversions. Some cases of Christian conversion to Judaism involved Christian women who converted to Judaism and married Jewish men. In 1170, in England, for instance, the highborn Merold, heiress of Sir Humphrey de Hurlem, converted to Judaism and married Jacob, son of Moses of Norwich. As a result of her apostasy, Merold was deprived of all of her lands, and an exorbitant fine was imposed on the entire Jewish community. Sources also preserve fragments of the experiences of Christian men who converted to Judaism and married Jewish women. In a case from 1222 made famous by Frederick William Maitland, for instance, a Christian deacon was burnt at the stake in Oxford for undergoing circumcision for the sake of a Jewish woman whom he had married. Other cases show that some converts were intellectually engaged with Judaism, as had been the case in a number of prominent early medieval conversions to Judaism. For instance, in a responsum, Rabbi Yoel ben Isaac Halevi of Bonn described a proselyte named Abraham ben Abraham who, quote, as the Spirit rested upon him, drew near the Lord's work to seek the Lord, to study Torah and the Holy Tongue. In 1275, a London Dominican known as Robert of Reading, who had himself circumcised and named Haggai and was handed over to the Archbishop of Canterbury for correction, was said to have been well trained in Hebrew. It is well known that some medieval Christian scholars expressed an admiration for Jewish learning, studied with rabbis, and pored over Jewish Bible commentaries, even quoting Rashi in their own exegesis. Cases of conversion, however, suggest that medieval Christian Hebraism was fraught with peril. In the process of seeking a deeper understanding of Christian truth, Christian scholars could be drawn to Judaism. More broadly, evidence of 13th century conversions to Judaism indicate that during the same century when Jews were strongly associated in the popular Christian imagination with the devil, filth, and greed, when accusations of ritual murder were on the rise, when violent attacks against Jews and expulsions of Jews increased, and when cartloads of Jewish books were consigned to flames on account of their infectious, blasphemous, and heretical contents, some Christians found individual Jews and Judaism so deeply attractive that they risked their lives to become one with them. Although these cases of conversion to Judaism were few and far between, their very existence, and especially when involving Christian clerics or other educated or high-ranking individuals, had to have been deeply troubling to Christian authorities. The departure of members, and in particular leaders, from the Christian fold threatened the cohesion of the Christian community. It rendered the relationship between dominant and subordinate groups unstable and uncertain, suggesting that the Christian community's confidence in the self-perpetuating strength of its cultural norms might be misplaced. From a theological perspective, conversion from Christianity to Judaism seemingly undermined Christian notions of revelation and salvation, which understood Christianity as fulfilling the promises of Hebrew Scripture and viewed Christians as replacing the Jews as God's chosen people. Moreover, due to the great risks involved in converting to Judaism, not to mention occasional martyrdoms of Christian converts to Judaism, including 7 men and 3 women who embraced death in Mainz during the late 13th century during a pogrom, it may have appeared unsettlingly plausible to some Christians that, in the words of a late 13th century Franco-German Jew, Christians would not convert to Judaism unless they, quote, knew for certain that the Christian faith was without foundation and that it was all a lie, vanity, and emptiness. These concerns must have been all the more alarming to Christian authorities as they joined a constellation of factors in high and late medieval Europe that seemed to indicate that Christianity's victory over Judaism was not secure. Christians observed, for instance, how in subversion of the prescribed social order, many Jews actually prospered. Christians not only worked in Jewish homes, but they borrowed money at interest from Jews and bought meat from Jews that Jews did not deem fit for their own consumption. In certain parts of Europe, Jews even acceded to public office. Even when it came to religious matters, it was not always clear that Christianity felt itself superior. Not only did some Christian scholars seek instruction from Jews, but on occasion Christian preachers, such as the 13th century Catalan Franciscan Francesc Eixamenis, cast Jews as morally admirable, if in the context of upbraiding Christians, praising the solemnity with which Jews fasted and worshipped on the Sabbath, and extolling Jews' modest dress. Whereas there is little question that medieval Jews on occasion instilled doubts in Christians' hearts about Christianity, and that some Christians were attracted to Judaism, not all of the claims in papal, royal, and conciliar sources about Jewish influence that we outlined at the start of this paper withstand scrutiny. In particular, it seems unlikely that 13th century Jews recruited converts to Judaism. Of course, cradle Christians could not convert without the support of at least some Jews, and Jewish sources do refer to various stages of the Jewish conversion process that required intensive Jewish guidance. In the 13th century Sefer HaYashar, for example, Rabbi Moshe of Pontoise referred to a proselyte whose master, the brother of Rabbi Moshe, had taught him night and day Torah and Mishnah. At the turn of the 13th century, Rabbi Yoel Halevi of Bonn described a convert who dwelled with us for a long time, moving between the communities of Cologne, Speyer, and Würzburg. In the context of a discussion regarding whether a ger toshav was permitted to touch kosher wine, the Tosafot mentioned a proselyte who had been circumcised and who, quote, lived a long time as a Jew without yet having proceeded to ritual immersion. Moreover, for what it is worth, Jews were periodically punished for abetting conversion to Judaism. There is no indication, however, that Jews actively proselytized, let alone that, as one papal bull claimed, they offered inducements for conversion. To the extent that papal, royal, and conciliar sources cast Jews as deliberately and maliciously preying on Christians, it was in large part, as we've already noted, simply in keeping with the Christian anti-Jewish stereotypes of the period. It is possible, however, that in the context of grappling with fears about Jewish religious influence on Christians, that casting Jews as vicious predators also served as a way of exonerating Christians for what would, by any other measure, appear to be a shocking and shameful lack of Christian religious commitment. Indeed, it was perhaps to this same end that papal, royal, and conciliar sources so often specified that the Christians whom Jews influenced were the simple-minded and ignorant ones. By attributing Jewish religious influence on Christians to Jews' evil machinations, however, Christian authorities also avoided acknowledging an even greater scandal, namely that 13 centuries after the birth of Christ, the accursed Jews, in their damnable superstition, still retained vitality and allure. In sum, examining the pronouncements of Christian authorities in conjunction with other texts reveals, or at least suggests, that under a range of circumstances in high medieval Europe, Jews actually could and did religiously influence Christians. Situations in which the dominant power dynamics were subverted, whether because Jews were in the majority or held sway over Christians on account of professional conditions or their powers of persuasion, could be conducive to Jews instilling doubts about Christianity in Christians and bore the potential to draw Jews' Christian employees to Judaism. In addition, unique personal circumstances or experiences involving affective bonds and intellectual inclinations could lead individual Christians to contravene social pressures and even risk their lives by converting to Judaism. Together with an appreciation of the theological significance of Christian conversion to Judaism, an appreciation of the extent to which subversions of reigning Jewish Christian power dynamics and individuals' personal experiences could upend the typical direction of religious influence in medieval Christendom, deepens our understanding of why high medieval Christian authorities considered Jewish-Christian intermingling so spiritually hazardous. More broadly, it demands that one think again before assigning medieval Christians and Jews to fixed categories in relation to one another. I have a short coda to this paper, if you'll allow me one paragraph. The 13th century is often known among medieval Jewish historians, among other things, as a time of Christian conversionary fervor, marked by public Jewish Christian disputations and compulsory Jewish attendance at mendicant sermons. This upsurge in Christian conversionary fervor has been attributed to several factors, ranging from the Church's discovery of the Talmud and its centrality in Jewish life, to an effort to attempt to take advantage of an actual uptick in conversions which were occurring for a range of practical reasons. I'd like to close by suggesting that in addition to helping us understand the frequency of references on the part of 13th century Christian authorities to the risk of Jewish religious influence on Christians, and in addition to inviting us to rethink medieval Jewish-Christian power dynamics, daily realities involving Jewish religious influence on Christians may also deepen our understanding of the 13th century dream of conversion, the Christian 13th century dream of conversion. Is it not possible that 13th century Christian missionary campaigns also responded to a heightened awareness and concern that some souls were, however infrequently, moving in the opposite direction, that is, from Christianity to Judaism? It seems at least worth considering that these Christian conversionary efforts might have been motivated not only by intellectual reassessments of contemporary Judaism, and possibly by opportunism, but also by what was apparently perceived, and certainly portrayed, as a dire and intolerable threat to Christian commitment and cohesion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next talk is being given by two speakers. First one, Rika Benveniste, who was born in Salonika, Greece. She studied history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and completed her doctoral studies in medieval history at the Université de Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne. She has taught at the Ionian University of the Aegean, and is now a professor of European medieval history at the University of Thessaloniki. Her research interests include historical anthropology of the Middle Ages and of historiography. Her more recent book is From the Barbarians to the Moderns, Social History and Historiography of the Middle Ages. It came out in Greek in Athens in 2007. And her forthcoming book, Resistance, Deportation, and Coming Back, Jews of Salonika in the 1940s, will appear in the fall of 2014. Giorgos Plakotos is a lecturer in early modern European history in the Department of Social Anthropology and History at the University of the Aegean. He has studied history at the University of Athens, the University of Glasgow. His research and publications focus on practices and discourses of criminal justice, constructions of otherness and gender representations, particularly in Renaissance and Counter-Reformation Italy. The subject of their talk today is Converting Bodies, Embodying Conversion in the Medieval and Early Modern Period, the Production of Religious Identities in the Spanish and Venetian Inquisitions.
Thank you, Professor Lasker. A rich literature has stressed the multiple ways in which the body in the medieval and early modern period was created and lived, either as subjected to authoritative discourses or as a field of knowledge and power. Social and cultural boundaries were projected onto bodies. The body was a privileged site for the articulation of the discourse on conversion. The discourse on conversion has been historically conditioned. It informed constructions of self and otherness in terms of integrity, erasure, estrangement and or assimilation, hegemony and subjugation. As Susan Conklin Akbari has recently shown in medieval Sanson and romances, the Saracens' transformation into a Christian entailed bodily transformation as well. Polarities were deeply embedded and reproduced in the discourse on conversion. In Christian discourse, Jewish conversion was perceived either as a miracle or a fraud, with Jewishness being secretly and stubbornly maintained. Motivation, genuineness, insincerity, and dissimulation became ingrained in this discourse which, as Paola Tartakoff has recently highlighted, Christians and Jews shared. Other polarities such as mind-body, spirit-flesh, or man-beast also conditioned Jewish-Christian relations. Bodies were often the semiotic battlefields whereon such polarities were projected. As the discourse on conversion was loaded with conceptual dichotomies, the convert's body provoked anxieties about the fragility and porousness of identity boundaries and classification. Our paper will deal with inquisitorial apparatuses in late medieval Spain and early modern Venice, and their treatment of bodies that were conceived as representing the in-between, the ambiguous, and the composite that threatened religious boundaries. We discuss how the inquisitorial trials turned the convert's body into a textual body of evidence read by witnesses and inquisitors, and into a surface for the ritual inscription of punishment read in public. In the realm of officialdom, the convert's body turned into an enemy body, or into a site of objectification, and Jewishness was naturalized. Thus, trial records archived the body by fitting it to a typological imaginary, to borrow Catherine Biddick's term. Our paper is structured around three main themes. I will proceed with the first theme, the convert's body under surveillance. In a preparatory inquiry preceding the trial, inquisitors collected evidence about practices in which bodies held a central role. Evidence included rumors and hearsay, but also eyewitnesses reports. It was a kind of knowledge often based on the witness's memory, on the power of observation. In the procedure, immersed a body under surveillance from the onset of the convert's path to Christianity and then backwards to Judaism. The inquisitorial procedure institutionalized a panoptical regime that diagnosed and captured the convert's bodies. Suspicions or accusations of Judaizing were associated with visible practices involving the convert's body: practicing or attending a circumcision ritual, eating kosher, burying the dead according to Jewish rites, transgressing Christian laws, or refusing to cross oneself. Similarly, in Inquisition cases involving conversos in Venice, the body was inscribed into the discursive articulation of Judaizing as a privileged site of surveillance and identification, especially outside the ghetto areas, which was the primary marker of Jewishness. Witnesses often drew on officially established modes of identification, such as the compulsory use of the yellow or red headgear for the Jews. The change in headgear became part of a typology of Judaizing that gradually took shape in Inquisition procedures. This typology also included other body-related signs of Judaizing, such as dietary customs, which were mostly defined as deviations from Christian dietary laws. Dietary customs were often inserted in the evidence-gathering process as a more intimate knowledge between public appearance and private life. Finally, in another powerful and recurring set of body-related signs, Judaizing was constructed by interweaving rituals and individual behavior. Witnesses regularly included in their testimony the non-observance of Christian customs, such as mass attendance, confession, and communion. At the same time, witnesses resorted to a wide range of non-official but deeply embedded in everyday life rituals to define Judaism: disregard for piety in public by avoiding kneeling and taking off one's hat when the Hail Mary was rung, crossing oneself, or lighting torches on Good Friday night were regularly included in the discourse of Judaism. The Inquisition's techniques aimed discipline through fear. The relatively simple ritual condemnations of the early years of the Spanish Inquisition became grandiose ceremonies during the next centuries. Humiliating an enemy body is a way of taking revenge on it. In the solemn In the solemn and strict ritual of the auto da fe, the body and bodily performances served the public manifestation of crimes committed. Penitential garments signified the altered status, shame, and imminent punishment of the condemned, even of those who had been tried in absentia and only their effigies were present. The mortal remains stood as a reminder of those who had been condemned after death. Bodies and effigies were burned and turned into ashes that were scattered through the fields or on the river. But the memory of those bodies turned to ashes was kept, for usually the San Benitos of the executed persons, bearing the victims' names, would be placed in local churches. The spectacle of the auto da fe and the convert's body were imbued with meaning. It has been argued convincingly that for Christians the ritual provided an image for the Judgment Day. It also served as an evocation of a pilgrimage to an eschatological judgment. On the other hand, the convert's body may be given different meanings by different spectators, Christians and converts, Jews and Judaizers. For converso spectators, the person burned at the stake could be turned into a martyr. A body proven fearless of fire became a martyr body. According to Miriam Bodian, the image of an accused who, by confessing to Judaism, chose death rather than reconciliation with the church, gave shape to a crypto-Jewish notion of martyrdom. The convert's body was also the site where technologies of Christian education were exercised and manifested. We get a glimpse into Christian re-education as a bodily performance in a case involving Judaizing conversos in mid-1580s Venice, where reconciliation of converts with the church was a private right that took place in the Inquisition. Before the Inquisitor, the offender named Francisco was required to cross himself and recite the Credo. As he performed as asked, the Inquisitor continued to enforce a disciplinary program focused on the body. He admonished the offender that while reciting the Credo, he should show reverence by bowing his head at the verses mentioning Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary. A second theme in our paper is the convert's body as a battlefield or a dialogue field. Christians and Jews mirrored themselves in each other, and religious conflicts often took the form of wars of rituals, cross-pollinating each other. The Christian ritual of baptism had to be counterbalanced by a Jewish ritual and vice versa. The trial turned a rite of rejudaization into an archive. This rite included nail cutting, the shaving of the head, and washing of the body. However, the rite was not prescribed by the Talmud, and rabbis did not adopt it, which may indicate their refusal to credit the Christian sacrament of baptism with any value. However, Rigordus, Philip Augustus' chronicler, reports relapsed converts coming out from the synagogue with their hair shaved. As the Inquisitor Bernard Guy believed, and evidence from Provence and popular attitudes suggest, a rejudaization rite consisting of an abjuration oath and an immersion had indeed taken place. The practice survived in later periods, as the Fournier Register suggests, where the violently converted Baruch is present describing the ritual to the Bishop of Pamiers. All this probably suggests a war of rituals. As late as the 1580s, in a case of Judaizing in Venice, the Inquisitor was reluctant to accept an accused person's claim that himself and his family had returned to Judaism simply by receiving new Jewish names by a rabbi in Ferrara. The Inquisitor insisted that the accused reveal the acts and ceremonies that had taken place. The inquisitor's inquiry produced rejudaization as an elaborate ritual. Thus, in inquisitorial trials, the convert's body appears as a dialogic entity in Bakhtinian terms, in that it enacts a concentrated dialogue between two voices, two worldviews, and or two languages. In a similar vein, the convert's body was discursively constituted as a site for producing and classifying religious identities during the encounters between the Inquisition and individuals suspected of crypto-Judaism. In Venice, in a series of cases of Judaizing from the 1540s until the late 16th century, identity as performance and the body became sites of an unequal dialogue on identity. Cases of the 1540s and 1550s indicate divergent conceptualizations of the body on behalf of the inquisitors and accused persons. For the inquisitors, somatic marks, mainly circumcision, served as proofs of Jewishness. However, defendants challenged any identification of Jewishness based on somatic marks or body-related performances. For instance, Juan Francisco Olivier, probably converso from Portugal, who was finally punished as a Jew violating laws governing Christian-Jewish relations outside the Venetian ghetto, argued that, I quote, "I am a Christian. It is true that I am circumcised and my father got me circumcised, and I do not remember when I got circumcised or received baptism, but I have always been a good Christian." In another instance, he said, "If you ever find out that I wore the yellow hat, or I lived in the Jewish manner, or I ate and drank according to the Jewish customs, I will submit myself to every punishment." End of quotation. The body retained its significance in inquisitorial discourse throughout the 16th century. However, we can discern a shift in the conceptualization of somatic marks for the classification of identity after Paul IV's Val cum nimis absurdum in 1555. Gradually, inquisitorial discourse and practice in cases involving individuals of converso origin who were accused of Judaizing crystallized. In applying the new policy initiated by Paul IV, inquisitors sought to establish the accused person's place of birth and circumcision, which now both formed the basis of classification. In the new papal policy, birth in the Iberian Peninsula signified baptism, and the establishment of circumcision signified adherence to Judaism, which now was deemed as an act of apostasy from Catholicism and therefore subject to punishment. In this view, circumcision was conceptualized as irrefutable proof of apostasy. In establishing Jewishness, a detailed inspection of whether the accused was circumcised became part of the inquisitorial procedure. But circumcision also became a site where the accused person's complicity and intention could be read. In the mid-1580s trial against the Denise family in Venice, the inquisitor ordered a detailed examination in order not only to confirm circumcision, but also to establish the time it had taken place, that is, whether the accused had been circumcised in adulthood. In the 15th century Spanish manual Repertorium Inquisitorum, it was stipulated that, I quote, "There is a difference between the Inquisition's circumcision and those who convert to Judaism, because the Jews circumcise their Jewish children in a different way from those who turn to Judaism when they are adults." End of quotation. The Repertorium Inquisitorum was in use in the Venetian Inquisition after 1575. Reading the convert's body required expertise. Jewish converts in Venice, often related with Venetian institutions such as the Pia Casa dei Catechumeni, the catechumen's convert's house, and physicians were deemed capable of contributing to the Inquisition's work. The examination of somatic marks was thus institutionalized as a technology of power with two interwoven processes at work, objectification and expertification. While the body served as a marker of defining Jewishness, in other conversion cases, the Venetian Inquisition conceptualized identity without reference to body-related performances and somatic signs. In the 17th century, the Inquisition dealt with a series of cases involving individuals who claimed that they had converted to Islam and wished to return to Christianity. These converts recurrently presented themselves as fashioning a double identity, an outward and superficial conformity to Islam, often involving circumcision and dietary custom, and an inward adherence to Christianity. These cases almost always concluded with the convert's reconciliation with the church. Here a different conceptualization of identity emerged. Overall, in inquisitorial discourse, conversion and the binarism body and soul served to reinforce religious identification. This discourse identified the despiritualization of Jewishness by anchoring it in the body, and at the same time emphasized a dematerialization of Catholicism by disentangling it from the body. And now we'll proceed to the third part of our presentation. The convert's body and reproduction, or descent, or we would say the racializing moment. The blood obsession of the late Middle Ages has been studied by Caroline Bynum in specific acts and in different texts and contexts. Blood as a symbol, an object, or a doctrine was crucial in thinking about boundaries. Moreover, blood naturalized difference in general and the convert's difference in particular. The belief in the immutability of converts and their descendants lay on the genealogical assertion that is on blood. It presupposed the idea that faith, religion, or culture is produced and reproduced in the same way as the species procreates itself. Thinking about converts took a genealogical term. Razza, casta were terms applied to converts. Blood was a metonymy for the chain of hereditary transmission carried by lineages and genealogies. Despite opposing voices, the anti-conversion arguments prevailed and led to the statutes of purity of blood. Since the 16th century, the purity of the blood doctrine had created a distinction between old and new Christians in Spain. Degenerate Jewish blood was impervious to baptism and Christian grace. Mixed with Christian blood, the Jewish blood would indefinitely continue to contaminate subsequent generations. Joseph Gerusalmi had emphasized that in many Spanish and Portuguese texts, the descendants of Jews were called maculados after the stain in their blood. The Inquisition did not instigate the purity of blood statutes. However, its function was complementary to the establishment of the statute. The simplest proof that an individual was of Judeo-converso origin was to remind that one among his or her ancestors had been condemned by the Inquisition as a heretic. Moreover, the campaigns for habilitation and the edicts of grace were used by the first inquisitors in order to elaborate genealogies and lists of names that would constitute a register of suspects for internal use. This activity of classification and defining reconfigured the statutes of blood purity. In recent years, there has been an increasing interest in race in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. a strand of historical thought has rightly argued that projecting race to the past might be slippery ground. Equally, the tendency of a certain structuralist intellectual history or history of discourse to ignore the context in which body discourses are embedded and performed has been duly appropriately criticized. Instead of investigating race and racial thought and practice in genealogical terms, we might study various strategies of naturalization, hierarchy, identification and discipline in different contexts and think of these past strategies' transformation into conceptual structures or topic to be later recontextualized and reconceptualized. In our paper, we located the convert's body in different chronological and cultural texts. Our purpose was not to generalize about converts' experiences, but to show that bodies, because they mattered, contributed to the construction of a conversion figure, which became a site for the exercise of strategies of naturalization. The convert's body became embedded in a discourse of objectification through expertification, constituting it a marker of differentiation and identification. Does this 16th century inquisitorial notion of somatic immutability re-emerge recontextualized in later racial thought? The notion of stained blood perhaps brings us dangerously close to modern concepts of race. 16th century antisemitism transcended traditional medieval anti-Judaism towards an increasing identification of Jewishness as a biological state or as an immutable state and consequently polluting. If in the modern racist idiom, Jews injected their blood into that of their hosts, polluting from within, rather than removing the Christian blood for their own purposes, as in the ritual murder, in the Spanish context, large number of Jews sought to enter society as converts. Here there is a revealing analogy, if not a continuity. Despite the variation and multiplicity of what can be termed converso experiences, there is something of a converso figure in European history. The Inquisition or the Inquisitions played a major role in crafting this enemy body with tropes out of which the dominant fictions that hounded the Western imaginary were plotted. Focusing on the converso experience and on its role in the formation of European culture, the historiography of the last few decades has assumed a rather optimistic perspective. Converts have been considered agents of religious neutrality or agents of doubt. They have been conceptualized as intercultural brokers and mediators of dualist oppositions, as precursors in struggles for the right to self-definition and as forerunners in the road to modernity. However, focusing on the body as a privileged site of metaphors used in polemics and considering the implications of the identification of the convert's body as an enemy body, we are led to a more pessimistic view. An experiment in biological discrimination and discipline was carried out on converts' back. This was a dark side of modernity, which had its roots in the late medieval period. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rika. Next speaker is Yanai Israeli of the University of Michigan, who earned his BA in History from Tel Aviv University, is now a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Michigan, which I learned last night with Ryan's speech. His research interests include power, urbanism, and literary practices in late medieval and early modern Spain. He is currently conducting the research for his dissertation project, which deals with Republican ideology, political and religious violence and state formation of 15th century Castilian cities. He is one of the recipients of the Mellon International Dissertation Research Fellowships of the Social Science Research Council for 2014-15. Subject of his lecture will be the Republic and its enemies, tyrants and conversos in the time of Alfonso de Palencia.
Thank you very much. I actually have a PowerPoint presentation.
If you want to see the PowerPoint, you might want to do it.
In the second book of his monumental Latin chronicle, the Gesta Hispaniencia, the royal chronicler Alfonso de Palencia depicted how in 1474, Juan Pacheco, the Marquis of Vienna and one of the most dominant figures in the Castilian aristocracy, instigated a riot in the city of Segovia. He had a word in the ear of several Segovian nobles, saying that the intolerable customs of the conversos have always been directed towards the general oppression of the other citizens, and that without any shame, they had seized all the public offices and greatly abused them in injury to the others, disrespect to those who merit nobility, and harm to the common good. And he also said that the conversos show no fear to oppose religion, and that among themselves they were engaging in disgraceful plans as a separate nation that nowhere accept the old folk in partnership. The words put by Palencia in Pacheco's mouth provide a good point of departure for my talk today, which examines 15th century discourses of violent conflicts involving all Christians and conversos in the Crown of Castile in the period between the Revolt of Toledo in 1449, which represents the first documented large attack against an urban population of Castilian conversos, and the establishment of the new Inquisition in Seville in 1480. More specifically, I would like to focus on two central yet understudied aspects of these conflicts and their representations. First, the roles played by notions of the Republic, the common good, in shaping their meanings. And second, the question of converso collectivity and its relation to the problem of violence. Following a short introduction, I will analyze the reports of such conflicts in one work, the Gesta Hispaniencia of Alfonso de Palencia. This will lead me to notions of the common good and their deployment in some of the texts composed around the Revolt of Toledo in 1449. In the final part of the paper, I will examine several sources tracing different views of conversos as a group and of the violence affecting them. With all this, I will try to make four central points. First, that some of the key narratives accounts of conflicts between all Christians and conversos are filtered by rhetorical and ideological lens that have not been sufficiently studied. Second, that conflicts between all Christians and conversos were important sites where emerging Castilian concepts of the Republic came to be appropriated, deployed, and negotiated, and that certain aspects of such conflicts can be better understood when set against this particular backdrop. Third, that in contrast to certain essentialist notions of conversos as a social group, 15th century sources disclose competing models of collectivity. And fourth, that the sources also disclose traces of a debate on collective condemnation, in which the idea of an inquisition emerged not as an instrument of collective violence against conversos, but as an alternative to collective punishment and an indistinguishable mode of aggression. As often argued, the period between 1449 and 1477 saw an escalation in the level of violence involving all Christians and conversos in Castile, with conflicts erupting in various cities. This escalation has been explained by scholars as a consequence of a political and economical crisis, an increasing social competition between all Christians and conversos, and the gradual consolidation of new identities and mechanisms of distinction. In this talk, I will not try to provide any new explanation for why this period saw an escalation in the degree of violence. Instead, I would like to make a few observations on how such conflicts were framed in 15th century sources. Rather than an object of study, the various concepts and frameworks informing 15th century descriptions of such conflicts have been often treated by historians as something that needs to be removed in order to reconstruct the true course of events. In some cases, representations were reduced to either pro or anti-converso and were treated in isolation of a broader political culture. Moreover, while conflicts involving all Christian and conversos have been typically seen as articulation of essentially the same type of event, a careful reading of the sources disclose a variety of scenarios. If some accounts, for instance, depict a violent riot against all the converso population of a given city, others describes what seems to be an uprising against local officials or a struggle between two urban aristocratic factions. There are also many accounts of conflicts considered as attacks against conversos in which there is no reference to any converso context, although we may know or suspect that some of the people involved were indeed conversos. This last possibility is particularly true for the royal documents that came down to us, a few dozens of which pertain to such conflicts, typically consisting of petitions presented at the court of the Catholic monarchs by people who suffered damages. In such documents, violence tend to be framed in terms such as movimientos y escándalos, commotion and scandal that occurred in the city, or escándalos y movimientos del pueblo común, the scandals of the common people of that city. Only rarely does one encounter a descriptions such as los vecinos de la dicha ciudad se levantaron contra los conversos vecinos de ella. The citizens of that city rose up against the converso citizens of the city. To be sure, the absence of the category conversos in many documents does not necessarily mean that the events depicted in them were not seen by contemporaries as attacks against conversos. However, the different categories used in the sources need to remind us that violent events often had more than one layer, and that in any case they could have been framed differently by different social actors, highlighting different elements according to different discursive contexts and rhetorical strategies. When 15th century accounts frame acts of violence as conflicts between all Christians and conversos, it is possible to distinguish between three central explanations for the eruption of violence. In the first, violence is associated with an intention to rob conversos, often under the pretext of accusation in heresy. In the second, the corrupted behavior of conversos, the abuse of public offices, displays of religious dissent, and often a combination of both, is said to trigger the aggression, while in the third, violence is entailed by a conspiracy of certain instigator who set all Christian and conversos one against the other. Composed around 1477 by Alfonso de Palencia, a secretary and chronicler at the court of Isabel and Fernando, the Gesta Hispaniensia is one of the key sources for studying violent conflicts between all Christians and conversos in this period. Particularly detailed in nature, the Gesta's accounts provided an important basis not only to a number of later Castilian chroniclers, but also to many of the modern discussions of such events. Moreover, in contrast to the interpretation of Netanyahu, who saw Palencia's approach to conversos as inconsistent and contradictory, I argue that the Gesta's accounts represent one of the most complete attempts made by a 15th century chronicler to situate violence affecting conversos within a cohesive historical framework. More specifically, these accounts seem to play an important rhetorical role in the broader narrative deployed by Palencia throughout his chronicle. In this narrative, the recent past is highlighted as a period of calamities inflicted on Castile by a corrupted ruler, the former monarch Enrique IV, and by tyrannical elements within the Castilian nobility. Descriptions of violence erupting between old Christians and conversos were designed by Palencia to enhance a representation of a kingdom whose common good was demolished by tyranny and corruption, two features he associated with the former regime and the political opponents of his own patrons, the Catholic kings. Let us consider one example, the Gesta's report on the riots that erupted in the town Carmona in 1462, which is attributed to the local royal governor. Omitting the numerous crimes committed by the governor, I will only mention the riots he stirred up against the neophytes the recent converts to the Catholic faith, whom it seems easy to throw into the conspiracies of the factious wicked. Those, under the color of religion, were thirsty for their wealth, as if religion supports plundering, murdering, raping, and committing wickedly the most violent things. The immediate context in which this report is given is a series of episodes where the perverse and corrupted character of Enrique IV is gradually exposed. The report on the royal governor who instigated the riots turns in the next paragraph into a direct criticism on the monarch himself, who refuses to punish the governor, a member of an influential noble house, thus failing to restore order and to resolve the crisis. To analyze Palencia's description only as an evidence of an anti-converso riot is to fail recognizing how this description functioned within a broader critical discourse centering on the bad government of Enrique IV. Also disclosed in this passage is the idea that conflicts involving all Christians and conversos can trace their origin to the Castilian nobility. This idea, in fact, is articulated in all the Gesta's accounts of such conflicts, where the eruption of violence is most often attributed to the conspiracies of one particular aristocrat, namely Juan Pacheco. Given the fact that from the late 1460s, Pacheco headed the political party that rivaled Isabel and Fernando, it is not surprising that the historiography produced at their court, at the court of these monarchs, portrayed him as an enemy of the peace, an instigator of riots and scandals. This was also true for Alfonso de Palencia, who provided some of the most colorful depictions of Pacheco as a ruthless tyrant. By all means, he was a chief inventor of riot and uprising, and there was no one for whose mind the stirring up of discords was that pleasurable. From day to day grew his concern because his well-entrenched tyranny was agitated by the recognition that the inclination of the people was going towards the service of the princes, Fernando and Isabel. A concern which was by no means minor, has therefore encouraged the anxious Pacheco to spread fresh discords among the people. The discords mentioned in this passage are soon being identified by Palencia as pertaining to conflicts between old Christians and conversos. According to the Gesta, false rumors spread by Pacheco generated a conflict between old Christians and conversos in Toledo in 1465. In Toledo in 1467, Pacheco and the ministers of discord managed to instill fear in both parties, which led to a particularly violent riot. The series of grand attacks against conversos and in a number of cities and towns in Andalusia in 1473, as well as the riots in Segovia in 1474, are similarly attributed by Palencia to the tyrannical conspiracies of Pacheco. Now, the link between tyranny and the spread of discord was by no means unique to Alfonso de Palencia. It was rather a common idea in the political thought of the time, where it was often set in opposition to the notion of the common good. According to Palencia's contemporary Diego de Valera, while the king takes up arms to defend the republic, the tyrant does so to offend it. While the king seeks the advantage of his subject, the tyrant seeks his own advantage. While the king seeks unity and concord among his subject, the tyrant seeks dissension and discord. Palencia was also not the first to conceptualize conflicts between old Christian and conversos in terms of discord. This metaphor loomed large in many of the treatises composed a generation earlier, around the revolt of Toledo in 1449. The senior Castilian churchmen that condemned the rebels of Toledo, and famous among them was Palencia's mentor, Alonso de Cartagena, repeatedly claimed that by asserting difference between the old and new Christians, the rebels of Toledo saw discord within the church. To quote only one example among many, an interesting sermon written by an anonymous author in 1449, since the division in the Christian congregation pleases the rebel, they should be, and since they produce a split in the Church of God by separating brothers from brothers, they, the rebel, should be called schismatics. A paradigm for any city or kingdom, the unity of the church is coupled in this sermon with the notion of the common good. For great cities such as Rome and Jerusalem, the sermon explains, have fallen into destruction due to internal discords that broke out precisely when their citizens started to pursue their own interests rather than these of the common good. Ideas about the common good also inform the accusatory discourses made against conversos. A good example for this is the Sentencia Estatuto of Pedro Sarmiento which is often seen as the first pure blood act. Published by the rebel government of Toledo in 1449, the sentencia presented the killings, arrest, and expulsion that transpired in the city as necessary measures conducted to protect the common good of the city from the crimes made by the local conversos. Moreover, the sentencias draws a direct line between the protection of the common good and the need to remove conversos from public offices. The public notary, the main office from which converso officials were deposed, is depicted in the sentencia as officials that greatly concern to the service of the king and to a large portion of the common good of the city. These are only a few out of many examples that show that claims concerning the common good constituted a significant backdrop for 15th century Castilian discourses of violent conflicts between Old Christian and conversos. Forming part of a broader European language that can be called Republican, insofar as it underscored the protection of the common good as the modus operandi of the legitimate government, such claims began to emerge in Castilian documents and texts in the first half of the 15th century, and soon gained volume in various contexts. Conflicts between Old Christian and conversos constituted one site in which various social actors appropriated Republican concept. If in 1449 various defenders of conversos highlighted the common good as a unity threatened by discord, in accusatory discourses against conversos, the danger for the common good lies in governmental corruption and the abuse of public offices. In 1477, when he constructed his own representation of violence erupting between Old Christians and conversos, the royal chronicler Palencia built on both traditions, conceptualizing these conflicts as the fruits of discord disseminated by the corrupted and tyrannical leadership associated with the rival and enemies of the Catholic kings. I would like to turn now to the question of collectivity and violence. While the collective identity of conversos is still often assumed, explicitly or inexplicitly, by certain scholarly studies, I would like to suggest that in 15th century Castile, the question of whether and to what extent conversos form a distinct group was at the center of a debate whose traces can be found in various contemporary sources. In the Gesta Hispaniencia, in the passage with which I opened this talk, Pacheco accuses the conversos of acting like a separate nation, a concept he associates with their disrespect of religion, the Old Christians, and the common good. In 1449, a manifest associated with the rebels of Toledo argued that the converso constitute a fourth estate of baptized Jews. On the other hand, the anonymous sermon mentioned above argued against distinct collectivity of new Christians. Those who hold the faith of Jesus Christ are not called by any designated name of a nation or a people. They are not called Persians, Greek, Romans, Hispanics, Jews, or Gentiles, but are rather called by a general name, that is Christians, after Christ, the Savior of all. Viewing conversos as individuals of Jewish descent, rather than as a distinct group, is a position shared by various Castilian authors. For example, the royal chronicler Fernando del Pulgar, writing in the 1480s, hardly used the category conversos. In his account on the establishment of the Inquisition, Pulgar, a converso himself, employed expression emphasizing individuality, such as Christians of Jewish origin, certain individuals of that origin, or some men and women who conducted Jewish ceremonies. In one of his letters, Pulgar criticized the advocates of differences based on origin and descent, calling them those who, beaten by envy, sow scandal and division in their own nations. Rather than a separate group, Christians of Jewish origins, according to Pulgar, form part of the nation, while the separatists are those who deny their integration. I don't have time to discuss much further the complex trajectories assumed by the concept a nation in 15th century Castile. It should be noted, however, that conceptualizing conversos as a nation was by no means confined to accusatory discourses. Indeed, some of the dominant voices denouncing the rebels of Toledo in 1449 used the category nation, only charging it with their own meanings. To quote only one example, Fernán Díaz de Toledo, a highly influential royal administrator who was also a converso himself, claimed in his treatise against the rebels to speak on behalf of the poor and perplexed nation of the line of our Lord Jesus Christ according to the flesh. Likewise, Diaz described the eruption of violence against conversos as the great death and thefts and robberies which were made against that nation. If asserting or denying a distinct converso collectivity represent two positions in 15th century discourses of violence and conversos, then a third position was the replacement of a general collectivity with a local one. In other words, to contend that there are differences between different communities of conversos. In the Gesta Hispaniensia, the following response is attributed to certain conversos in Segovia, following Pacheco's claim about the separate nation. While he, Pacheco, throwed at the Cordovians and the other converts of the province of Andalusia evidence of violations of religion, the same thing cannot persuade the Christians of Segovia, because it has been proven that the new Christian people in Hispania are generally separated by their customs, and that there is a great degree of distinction between them. That is to say, that those of Burgos were known as the most observant. They had Father Pablo de Santa Maria, and after him his son Alfonso de Cartagena, the most illustrious prelates who instructed them thoroughly. And by their example, the major part of the converts in Hispania followed the path of rightness. And in many dioceses, that is in Calahorra, Osma, Palencia, León, Zamora, Cuenca, Avila, Salamanca, Segovia, and Sigüenza, there can hardly be found any evidence of infamy. And if the crimes of the converts of Toledo become known, or even bigger crimes in the dioceses of the province of Andalusia, nothing of this can imply the guilt of those of Segovia, or of other innocent converts who observe the Catholic law. What one encounters here is actually a division between northern and southern conversos, overlapped with a distinction between good Christians and heretics. Interestingly, one finds a very similar position in a text often considered as one of the key examples of anti-converso propaganda in the 1460s, the treatise known as the Book of the Alboraique. While this treatise launches a vehement attack on the criminal and hypocritical character of converts from Judaism, the text also makes distinction between different groups of conversos. In fact, the text seems to endorse a notion shared by various Jewish sources from the 15th century, according to which there is a decisive difference between converts who were forcibly baptized and hence inclined to return to Judaism, and those who made their conversion willingly. The Book of the Alboraique projects this notion on a geographical division, envisioning the conversos of the north of Old Castile as an ancient population of converts, distinguished from the supposedly newer and forcibly baptized population of southern conversos. Hence, the text insists that the false character of the new converts from the south should not be held as blame for the good among the conversos of Castile. For if they will be judged with the conversos of Andalusia, and even with those of Toledo, not all of them will be condemned as evil heretics. In fact, it is quite the contrary. For among the conversos of Old Castile, Burgos, Palencia, Valladolid, Zamora, León, etc., there can hardly be found any heretics. And on the other hand, in the kingdom of Toledo and Murcia, as well as in Andalusia and Extremadura, there can hardly be found any faithful Christians. In addition to the north-south division, both passages, this one and from Palencia, imply the rejection of collective condemnation. To conclude this talk, I would like to juxtapose 4 quotes revolving around this specific issue. The first one is taken from a rather lengthy digression in Fernán Pérez de Guzmán's biography of Pablo de Santa Maria, defined by the author as certain arguments against the opinions of those who, without any distinction and difference, condemn this nation of new Christians, converts of our time. While Pérez de Guzmán recognized that some conversos inclined to heresies, he insisted that there are also devoted and good people among them. For this reason, he asserted, a whole nation should not be condemned so completely and definitely. If it is known that some are breaking the law, let them be prosecuted before the prelates in a way that will constitute a punishment for them and examples for others. But to condemn everyone without prosecuting anyone seems more like a desire to harm than the zeal of correction. The second quote is taken from the chronicle of Diego Enriquez del Castillo, in which the author depicted the attack against conversos in Cordova in 1473 as a collective punishment sanctioned by God. In Cordova, the community, with the favor of several knights, rose with arms against the conversos, of whom many were killed and all were sacked. And it was not without a reason, for all of them, or the majority of them, were Judaizing with no shame, that God allowed that all shall suffer and will be killed and destroyed, some for committing such things and others for giving their consent. The third quote is taken from a letter of Miguel Lucas de Iranzo, the Constable of Castile, and a chief royal magistrate at the city of Jaén. Preserved at the Real Academia de la Historia in Madrid, this document is of a particularly interesting character, written only one day before Lucas was murdered by certain citizens of Jaén. Several contemporary reports connected the murder of Lucas to the riots against conversos that broke out a week earlier in Córdoba. Lucas was murdered, we are told, because he would not allow that Jaén's conversos will suffer the same fate as those of Córdoba. The letter he wrote a day before his assassination was addressed to the knights and aldermen of the nearby city Andújar, following news on riots erupting in that city as well. The obedience and loyalty of Andújar was particularly crucial to Lucas, who strove to maintain a regional dominance in a time of political crisis and facing powerful opponents. I was informed, the letter reads, on the commotion and scandal that took place yesterday in that city. And since this nation of conversos is of such character and condition in their ways of life, I have no doubt that they were deserved of that which has been done. But even if you have my agreement on that account, I certainly did not mean that you shall be angry on them in such a way. For in the current case, it would have been more just and honest, and it would have been looked better if some of the aforementioned folk who had lived wrongly against the good conscience or against the law were prosecuted and justly punished, rather than that which has been done against them generally, which did not look well. When I come to think about it, says Lucas, I believe that it was done with the permission of God, our Lord, so that the penalty that they have paid will constitute a punishment for them and examples for others in the future. This quote demonstrates the ambivalence embedded in various discourses of violence and conversos. Within the very same passage, the attack against the conversos is depicted as a scandal, a term designated a dangerous and even criminal action, and as a just punishment sanctioned by God. While the letter assumes that conversos are collectively deserved of being punished, it also rejects the collective attack against them, suggesting that violence should be applied legally and only to individuals. The rest of the letters goes on to praise the great loyalty of the knights and aldermen of Andújar. This seems to support the hypothesis that what Lucas was trying to forge in this letter is a framework with which the rioters in Andújar could retreat from any open rebellion against his own authority. By deploying different and even contested models of violence and collectivity, Lucas was able to signal that although he was dissatisfied with the scandalo that occurred in Andújar, he is still willing to accept the new situation created in the city. The letter frames the eruption of violence not as a sign of disobedience and rebellion against the authority of the constable, but as an act of aggression directed only against this nation of conversos. Rather than a defender of conversos, the constable is depicted in the letter as the keeper of the correct juridical procedure. Of course, if the conversos were essentially deserved what they received, if God permitted the attack, and if it was directed not against Lucas but only against the conversos, there is also no need for holding anyone accountable. The fourth and final quote is taken from the Sentencia Arbitral de Medina del Campo, an important political manifest for 1465, reflecting the negotiations between Enrique IV and the aristocratic party that rebelled against him in the 1460s. The Sentencia criticizes the monarch on various points, some of which focus on his failure to fight heresy. While some historians have read these parts of the Sentencia as criticizing the presence of conversos at the royal court, it is significant, as Stefania Pastore has shown, that the text refrains from referring directly to conversos or to Judaizing activity. It only speaks on many bad Christians. The Sentencia demands the king to punish the heresy and to conduct an inquiry, inquisition, in all the cities and towns in the kingdom. However, and this is an important point, the Sentencia, according to the Sentencia, if some are wrong in it, in the heresy, let them be punished and corrected. And those who are not guilty shall not be defamed or reproached or ill-treated. And between them and the citizens of this city shall not follow robberies or scandals. In an important study on the Spanish Inquisition, Stefania Pastore connected this passage from the Sentencia Arbitral to a debate dated to the 1460s concerning the kind of Inquisition that needs to be established. While certain circles within the Franciscan order pushed towards the anti-converso Inquisition that was eventually established, the leadership of the Geronimist order, whose position the Sentencia reflects, emphasized the need for a general and unbiased Inquisition. It seems to me that the text cited in the final part of my talk today point out to yet another important context in which the question of the Inquisition should be situated. What I was trying to demonstrate is that in some of the discourses of violent conflicts between old Christians and conversos in the period between 1449 and 1480, the options of an inquiry and inquisition emerges as an alternative to riots and general attacks against conversos. That is to say, an alternative to a collective and indistinguishable form of violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's put the lights back on, the speakers back up. Respondents to these three wonderful papers be David Sorotzkin, who is a scholar in critical modernity, religion, and secularization, and the identities, politics in Israel. His research focuses on core historical questions and problems concerning modern European and Jewish identities in early and late modern times. His PhD from Hebrew University in 2007 in the book Orthodoxy and Modern Disciplination, The Production of the Jewish Tradition in Europe in Modern Times, as his other publications examine the processes that produce the social and ideational structures of modern Judaism in early and late modern Europe. He's a research fellow here at the Center for the Study of Conversion, Ben-Gurion University, and teaches at Hebrew University.
Thank you. I understand I have a limited time here. I will do my very best to... I understand I have a very limited time here. I will do my very best not to make it longer. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to respond to this most interesting session, which included 3 lectures that addressed from different angles important issues in Jewish and Christian historiography, and issues that relate, to my opinion, to the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern era. In this short time, I cannot respond in detail, but rather would like to focus on several fundamental issues raised. Paola Tartakoff's lecture focused on what seems to be a paradox. Is it possible that in the 13th century, when some of the most negative attitudes regarding the Jews and the Jewish text were formed, authorities would have had reason to fear of Jewish influence on Christian society? And she responded to this question basically in the affirmative. The lectures of Rika Benveniste and Giorgos Plakotos addressed the relations of the body as indicated by inquisitional documents, primarily through focusing on the body of the conversos. In this context, the body was read as evidence and was reproduced and projected as a public object upon which rituals of punishment and atonement were performed. Yanai Israeli examined forms of violence as a basis for defining the conversos as individuals or alternatively as collective in political context in 15th century Spain, Castile. In this case, political discourse turned against tyranny, and conversos were defined as victims of tyranny on the one hand, or as direct product of tyranny and corruption on the other, or as one distinct urban competitive group. As a scholar of early and late modern Judaism, I have a special interest in issues raised in this framework because they involve 3 central constitutive and formative elements of the Jewish social body in the late Middle Ages, prior to their transition into the regulative principles of the early modern period. namely the separated, differentiated, and segregated formation of 1, the Jewish religion, 2, the Jewish collective, and 3, the Jewish body and subject. Indeed, from an inclusive perspective, the issues raised in the lectures that we heard relates to 3 types of elementary social formations prominent in Europe in the early modern era: the state, the collective, and the individual. In each of these cases, the Jew is formed as a shadow figure which reinforces the regulative principles of the Christian, individual, and collective. The insistence on the principle of separation between Christian and Jews, the segregative principle driven by the fear of infiltration described by Paola Tartakoff, and the racial principles of the purity of blood described at the end of the lecture by Ben-Gurion and Plakotos, both represent distinct collective proto-national characteristics. This issue also relates to the question of the origin of modern anti-Semitism. The question regarding whether the conversos should be treated as collective or merely as individuals that arise at some of the documents brought by Yanai Israeli reflects the identity impulses of the Christian collective in 15th century Castile and their political regulation. And the body, whose lineaments are read as textual evidence and whose exterior is publicly displayed as in processions and rituals of punishment and atonement, described by Ben-Veniste and Plakotos, clearly represent the religious apparatus that produced the individual. Here the production of the individual is conducted by exploring the private sphere and by regulating it as an organ in the public sphere.
Excuse me, David, you mind lifting your name tag over your shoulder? Because it keeps bouncing.
Oh, best try to take it off. Now, the period of the High and Late Middle Ages represent the regulation of Christian law and the early formation of the constitutional frameworks which will become the pillars of modern state. The development of ecclesiastical, cooperative and political law, the formation of inter-religious boundaries by the institutional and intellectual elites on the one hand, and the building of popular system of images and stereotypes on the other hand. In other words, and this is particularly important for my purpose, all these represent the formation of the early boundaries of European states and nations, in part by using identity demarcation practices. In the early modern period, we can observe the regulation of Jewish space with respect to its location in the Christian world and in relation to 3 or 4 prominent forms of demarcation. Demarcation of Jewish space, particularly through the creation of legal status of the ghettos. Demarcation of the Jewish body through demarcation forms intended to depict its inherent separateness from the Christian surroundings. Demarcations of Jewish text as deviating from biblical law as heresy and superstition, and demarcation of private and public Jewish space, among others through the Hebraist and ethnographic writing genre, which parallel their design in Jewish halachic and contact literature. As I noted, all of these forms of demarcation represented the penetration of the Christian engineering mechanism into the Jewish identity structures, and the location of this structure within the Christian frameworks and in relation to them. These frameworks were intended to constitute the unity of the subject, the religion, and the state, which was prominent in the confessional era. Religion functioned and will function from there on out as a mechanism which engineered the individual. The subject is now seen as an elementary unit upon which the sovereign writes his political text. Christian concerns of Jewish infiltration, which were depicted in Tartakoff's lecture, reflects the actual social contact between Jews and Christians. They also reflect a new social area which was formed between these groups with respect to the reformation of each. This was a highly dangerous and explosive area. The ritual murder accusations which gained momentum during that time represent a metaphor of this fear. The fear of the Jew infiltrates the Christian and makes use of his life substances. This issue bring us back to the central question of Tartakoff's lecture. In the 13th century, the negative image and status of Jews reached its peak. Why did authorities fear Jewish influence or the Christian or Judaization of Christians? In addition to its suggestions, another possibility for addressing these questions rose from the status of the stranger, as defined by sociologists Georg Simmel and others. The strangers who occasionally represent abjection also simultaneously create attraction. This is a psychological and social impulse. Additionally, since the 13th century, Judaism was seen as a secret, sometimes a dark secret, which needed to be revealed in order to protect Christians, but at the same time as representing, in a distorted way, ancient wisdom and knowledge, as Professor Tartakoff mentioned, which is essentially Christian. We should bear in mind that the sublime and the abjection are sometimes very close in terms of psychological impulse that defines them, and the Jews definitely took up this role in European culture. The focus on the body in the lecture of Benveniste and Plakotos shed light on the question of conversion during the period. Conversion is a form of interaction, creating transitional path between two distinct social groups which elevate and reshapes walls of segregation. And as a form of contact, it sheds light on a range of new questions and concerns: pollution, physical infection, and ideological contamination. And in more popular forms, this problem was manifested, as I said, in medieval ritual murder accusation, the ritual use of Christian blood, and the desecration of the communion. This is also a form of infection or injury to the body of Christ, the Christian individual, and the Christian community. In this framework, a new attitude was established toward both Jewish body and the Christian body. These were indeed the first seeds of racial demarcation: the dirty Jewish body, the Jewish predator, the Jewish intruder, and the like. The Christian body that was contaminated, the fear of penetration, and the desecration of the body are inseparably connected in the formation, design, and production of the body since the late Middle Ages. In the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern era, the conversos present this problem in all its severity. Henceforth, the dangers of the Christian body is not lurking outside or the mere fear of infiltration, but is present in the Christian social body itself. Therefore, the Christian body must be reread, such as a text, testimony, and the regulatory mechanism of the Inquisition and censorship must be used. 1 more minute. This factor connects to the topic raised by Yanai Israeli. Some of the text condemned the riots against the conversos and linked them with political tyranny. According to this approach, the Republic does not tolerate riots, but rather it prefers to regulate the status of the subject in relation to the states. In the conversos, if the conversos are an independent collective entity, then their place is somewhat unclear in relation to the Christian state. Thus, it is more efficient to see them as individuals. The Republic should deal with every individual independently through exploration or inquisition. What becomes clear here is the need for regularization, which is the proper political conduct, as opposed to riots, which link to tyranny and political decay. In conclusion, the relation to Judaism, including the conversos or the new Christian, was integrated throughout the late medieval and early modern times into the engineering formative frameworks which produced the individual, collective, and political Christian body. Simultaneously, this engineering mechanism also produced some of the main options of the Jewish identity from then on, and in many ways up to this very day, which is something which I cannot elaborate further now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes for questions, discussions, answers, comments.
Our comments to Yanai Israeli wonderful talk. You, as far as I understood you, you didn't mention, I think, two additional important concepts in order to understand the panoramic, fascinating view you gave us. The first is the rebellion. I think that it is unfair to portray rioters as only rioters. They were not only accused to be rebellious, but they claimed to rebel against a tyranny. And this is a very important thing, because in this case, the Republican messages were partook by all the sides and not by one or another side. We have to remember that those were times where the Spanish monarchies were not, I mean by that Castilian and Aragonese monarchies were not yet well established, and there were times where king's favorites emerged to power, like Álvaro de Luna and Del Pacheco you mentioned, and we have to place all these rebellions against those kinds of tyranny, where the conversos were seen as associates, as allies of those tyrants. And the second term is the mystical body, corpus mysticum. This is also a very important term, because this term not only has to do with the lectures we heard today, but because this term enters into the Republican discussion, and especially among pro-converso apologues, the Paulinian metaphor of corpus mysticum was a very powerful means to counterattack all those people in Segovia and presently in Toledo, that they claimed that the conversos should be separated, segregated as a collectivity.
Thank you very much.
I suggest you either stand here or stand there.
Thank you. I cannot agree more. I think that these are important points. In a longer version of this paper, I also addressed the memorial of Garcia de Mora that speaks about tyranny, and in this context, it's a very interesting text because it also connected to the entrance of certain Italian jurist who speaks about tyranny. He cites from Bartulos the Saxoferrato, for example, that we have like more than 100 manuscripts from the 15th century alone, so that was a highly popular text. So tyranny is there all the time in these discussions. I just couldn't, I had too many examples. The other thing, again, I totally agree. The same sermon that I was quoted from, again, there was another quote that the author speaks precisely on the corpus mysticum, and he has a very interesting idea of what is discord in this, how to use this metaphor to speak about discord. He says that the rebels of Toledo or anyone who strikes discord within the church is trying to detach the corpus mysticum of the church to separate the head from the body of Christ. And very interesting image, like taking a bride and cutting her and chopping off her limbs, and then to return her despised to her husband. So the bride is the church, and the husband is Christ. And so it's these are all very metaphor. These are all very loaded and charged with meanings, metaphors. And I agree, they are super. Both of them are very essential.
Yes, I would like to add a remark to Paola's excellent lecture about conversions to Judaism. There is one aspect that I would like to mention, that is the conversion of slaves belonging to Jews to Judaism. Sometimes they are Muslims, in most cases they are pagans, and the church tries to prevent that, of course. there are all sorts of debates and laws regarding the slaves of the Jews, which is also an aspect of conversion to Judaism. And I'd like also to mention something about Giorgos Plakotos' paper about the Inquisition of Venice. Well, they needed, when we're speaking about bodies and differentiation of bodies, they needed to distinguish between people whom they accepted as Jews, despite the fact that they sometimes converted, especially if they converted outside the community. So if they joined the Jewish community of Venice, they overlooked them. But if they wanted to live as Christians, then all these distinctions came in and came away. And thank you, all of you, for the excellent papers.
So just very briefly, the conversion of slaves and servants is very prominent in the Christian sources, and I tried to refer to that. One thing that's interesting, however, is that I haven't found any or heard of any archival evidence that supports these kinds of conversions, which does not mean that they didn't happen. And of course, what is conversion versus Judaizing? What happened in the privacy of homes? There's different types of conversions even today to Judaism. But I spoke, for example, with Rebecca Weiner, who focuses on Perpignan in the south of France and works on breastfeeding and other aspects of Jewish life. And she said she has come across cases of Muslim servants converting to Judaism, but never of a Christian servant converting to Judaism in the archival materials that she's looked at. And that is absolutely fascinating to me, and it's something that perplexes me and that I'm very curious about. So it's a distinct aspect of or category of the conversions I'm interested in, which seems to have its own complexities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nadia, for this comment.
The microphone right to the
Yes. Well, it's true that the Inquisition in Venice did not investigate, actually the Venetian state did not investigate conversions who settled in the ghetto and did not live outside the ghetto areas within the Christian population. However, if I would like to elaborate a little more on one of the arguments of our paper, that as far as conversions who lived outside the ghetto, dissimulating, we have a shifting conceptualization of their identity on behalf of the Inquisitor, which spans the 16th century. Before the 1555 and all the forts cum nimis absurdum, conversos were judged as Jews who violated the laws of Venice, that is, living outside. After 1555, conversos Inquisition investigations based on the body of the conversion classified conversions as Christians who had apostatized from Christianity and then were punished in a different way. So this is one of my main points as far as conversions outside the ghetto and not inside the ghetto.
Just for Paola, thank you again for the paper, which I found very interesting and convincing. Well, I just wanted to get to the detail about these breastfeeding, these wet nurses, because I mean, there seems to be this worry that the wet nurses may be sleeping with the fathers.
Yeah.
But this seems to go against a lot of the medical theory, and again, Rebecca Weiner would be able to talk to you more about this. But the medical theory is for example, Christine Clapius-Zuber has looked at Italy. For the medieval medical theory of the time, good milk has to be given by women who are sexually abstinent, and that any sex on the part of a breastfeeding woman is going to endanger the milk, which is one of the reasons that aristocratic families are having wet nurses, so that the mothers of the children can have sexual intercourse and give more have more children. So this would seem to fly in the face of the church's worries. What I'm wondering is there any evidence, and I don't know if you've come across of this other issue, and I mean I'm thinking of, and there are other issues raised, for example, by Innocent III in one of his letters to King Philip II of rights that Jews would be obliging their wet nurses after they've taken communion to express some of their milk into the latrine.
Yes.
So that kind of issue comes in as well.
Yeah. So Rebecca Weiner is really the expert on all of this, and it gets a little bit away from conversion to Judaism, but I'd love to know the answers to these questions, and I will be keeping my eyes open for them. One thing I learned from her, for example, is that in the context of these medical theories, it's one of the reasons why Jewish or Christian wet nurses or any wet nurses would have their husbands sign contracts as well, that not only would the Christian wet nurse obviously not sleep with the father of the child she's nursing, but she also wouldn't have relations with her own husband during that period for fear of contaminating the milk. But that doesn't mean that those relations didn't occur. And one thing that intrigues me is when they did, if they did, when they did, this is very speculative, what came of the children of those unions, and are those some of the do those children maybe create problems that some of the canon law that addresses children of mixed couples that are trying to sort out? I'm trying to figure out where some of those children come from, but that's actually a separate project, not what I'm speaking about.
Well, there are a lot of fueros that deal with the children of Muslim slave women, that in many cases with their Christian owners. But I don't know of anything dealing with Jewish. With the similar things of children of Jewish Muslim couples.
Or Jewish Christian. I haven't come across any actual evidence.
Does anybody want to respond to the response? Okay, Kenneth?
Well, I'm very pleased that a good deal of the discussion has centered on the issue of what is pure and what is impure. I think some of you know that I've written on this and once got to the point of saying that the competition between Judaism and Christianity were two systems of contact purity competing with each other. So to hear these discussions of whether it's a group of conversos or whether it's individuals in their actions or in the papal letters, I think this is very important reinforcement in that direction. At the same time, since John brought up the wet nursing issue, reminds me that we have to be very careful in reading our texts. That text about wet nursing, I don't believe it. I don't believe it's real, that is. It exists, yes. But Rigord and people like him were busy running around Paris saying the most extravagant things about Jews eating dough balls out of chalices. Now, how the hell could he have known that unless some convert told him such a thing, which probably wasn't true. So this thing about spilling, he may have known. And Effie, you were the one who gave me the article by Chagad Ben Shammai, in which it says, well, the wet nurses, what is it? It's chilul, it's desecration, and so on and so forth, to take from an idolatrous wet nurse and so on. That could have been linked on in some way, and they made up and they write to Innocent, and this is what I've discussed too. They write and they say, these are terrible things that are going on. There's in many of these accusations because they are simply afraid of contacting impurity. We have to be very careful in reading these things. I could go on, but of course I should.
Well, I talked about this 2 years ago at a conference in Jerusalem. Got into an argument with Jeremy Cohen on this, who's always a fun and interesting person to get in an argument with.
I assume Ephraim also wants to make a wet nurse comment.
Actually, no. It's a comment to Paola. But what's novel about your argument, as the title suggests, that this fear or concern is a factor in the segregatory legislation, and I think really, as Ken started to say on a different level, you have to distinguish here, or look very closely at what I'll call individual issues versus the collective issues as follows. That there were persuasive, even charismatic Jews who are getting somewhere, I think no one doubts, just as there are local clergy or even higher clergy who are expressing concern. I think where I'd like to push you a little bit is, though, I just jotted a couple of the dates, and there may be a France-Spain distinction here, which you didn't really talk about. You sort of put it all together. If we're talking about Cambridge in 1286, Innocent IV in 1244, Paris in 1213, it's still somewhat hard to imagine. You set it up so nicely with social majority issues, right, subversion of power dynamics. In those particular times in Northern Europe, it's very hard to think on a public level that the Christians are really concerned that much about Jews converting members. They're in complete control in all these places. They've just experienced all kinds of evidence for that. It's been very dynamic in all of the cases. 1213 is 2 years before Fourth Lateran. It's not many years before Jews are readmitted. So I think that there are individuals working successfully, and that there is individual concern on both sides. The psychological dynamic that was brought up by David. But I think that where we have to see something more is on this sort of public, ecclesiastical, higher legislation level. Again, there may be a distinction here between the Spanish and southern and northern context. That's the question.
Thank you so much. So one of the reasons why I didn't make a distinction is that there's between Spain and Northern Europe is that there's so little evidence to go by when one is looking at conversion to Judaism that I took whatever I could find and just expanded my geography to encompass as much as possible. But it's not only, I would hope to be able to do that even if there somehow miraculously were more evidence. I have a paper I'm revising now trying to expand the geographic framework for the study of medieval Jewish conversion, which is trying to highlight connections in the experiences of converts to Christianity across Ashkenaz and Sfarad, and arguing that the way in which conversion has been used as a rubric to showcase as totally different cultures is actually very misguided, and that we need to look at conversion actually as a way of tracing similarities and continuities across the Pyrenees. So yes, I'm switching in the paper that I shared with you today between these multiple registers, what's going on in the lives of individuals, what's going on in institutions, what are more abstract ideological factors in the mix here. Brian Catlos has a new book, Muslims of Medieval Latin Christendom, that just came out, which toward the end really convincingly and usefully articulates ways to conceptualize majority-minority relations pertaining to Muslims and Christians, but I think a lot of it applies also to Jews, in terms of macro, meso, and micro, I don't know what should come after those, but sort of units of society or approaches. I'm sure we can find a way to make that work for people, Jewish-Christian relations as well. But that's one of the next levels I want to take this with, is try to think a little more carefully about how the experiences of these converts and the ways that society is concerned about these conversions involves moving between these different registers. Thank you. I have to think more about this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I assume we can continue the discussion over lunch. The next session begins at 2 p.m.